The Ricoh Recollette is a small camera. Well, it's not really a small camera. Is a viewfinder camera that didn't make a huge splash when it was introduced in the 1950s. There were a number of other cameras from rival Japanese camera makers, and the Ricoh Recollette was simply one of them. I can't recall where I picked up this camera, but I picked it up along the way, and came with its own little lens cap. It was fairly dirty, but I've gotten it cleaned up, and it looks good. But it's a camera with very modest specifications. So taking a look around the camera, this camera uses a Ricoh and a Stigmat, and so it's a 3-element lens, which makes it a triplet. The maximum aperture is f3.5, and the minimum aperture is f16. This is a very simple shutter. I believe it only has a handful of speeds. In fact, that's true. Its top speed is 1/100th of a second. Your other options are 50, 25, and B. From the front of the camera, it looks like there's quite a bit going on here. This little shroud here, this piece hides the shutter tensioning mechanism, and this piece here hides the shutter release mechanism. This is a small little synchronization post. Well, actually not that small. Sort of large when you compare it with the rest of the camera. On the top deck, things are fairly simple. You have an accessory shoe, not a hot shoe, and so you would need some kind of synchronization cable if you plan to use a flash. This is your rewind knob, and it doesn't lift, just turns. Here on this side is your shutter release, and this is your rewind button. You have your frame counter here, and your film advance here. On the back, things are pretty simple. Just have an eyepiece. The Recollette has a very simple viewfinder. There are no frame lines, as you might expect from a camera made in the early 1950s. The eyepiece is not too small, but it's not too large either. It's typical of what you would see in that era. This is an incremental frame counter. Once you've loaded new film into the camera, what you would do is there's 2 little studs on either side of this frame counter dial/collar. After you fired off your 2 blanks, simply reset this to 0 and you're good to go. When it's time to rewind the film, the best thing to do would be to use the thumb on your left hand to press and hold that rewind button and then begin cranking. As I mentioned, this is fixed in position and does not pull outward. If it pulled outward, it would make rewinding film a bit easier because you wouldn't be bumping up against the viewfinder housing. But in fact, it is fixed in place, and so that's that. On the bottom of the camera, you have 3 things. One is you have your tripod socket, and you'll notice the tripod socket is way over here on the end of the camera. Of course, that makes things slightly more awkward when you're trying to position this on a tripod. Not a big deal, but just something to be aware of. This little lever here was simply to stabilize the camera, so when you sat it on a desk or something, it wouldn't tip over. Without that, see, it has a tendency to tip forward. So that was the only person of this swinging lever. It was just a little foot. Here you have 2 knobs. And so this used a removable back. And so you would turn these knobs in the direction of O for open. So in this case, you really turn them inward. In the lock position, which is here, so to unlock the back, you turn them inward, both toward the center of the camera, and then the back slides off the camera. Because of that, this has no foam seals or really any seals of any kind. Here's your pressure plate, and here's a small spring to keep your film cartridge from rattling around too much. This is your film rails. Obviously, this uses a very simple leaf shutter. As I mentioned before, it just has those 3 speeds plus B. Sprocket wheels, and this is your take-up spool. The pressure plate is highly polished, as you can tell, and rather small compared with some other cameras. So the role of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against the film rails And so when you take your photo, your film will be as flat as possible, and presumably you will take the sharpest photo possible. And that, of course, is dependent upon the lens being able to record a sharp photo. Now, with the triplet, you'll probably want to use it at the smaller apertures, probably f5.6, and probably all the way down to its minimum aperture of f16. So let's put the backpack onto the camera. With this back, you can just sort of place it on halfway, then slide it the rest of the way, and then turn these knobs toward the outside of the camera. Just keep turning until they don't turn anymore, and then you'll notice it's locked into place. Let's do a quick comparison with the Konica One. The Konica One is going to be roughly the same vintage, and if you notice from the back, they look vaguely similar. But most cameras do. However, not that similar because you have this button back here. If you notice, they're both knob wind with a frame counter around the around your film advance. They both have knob rewind, and this one, that, however, does have body shutter release, whereas this one, it's front mounted. Not nearly as convenient. This also has a fixed lens, whereas the Konica has a collapsible lens. Side by side, the Ricoh looks to be a bit wider. This is the Konica's a rangefinder camera, so that will give you the advantage in more accurate focusing. And it has a better lens in having the Hexar. Back to back, you can see how the Recollette is actually wider, noticeably wider than the Konica. Let's take a look at the weight of these cameras. So the Ricoh comes in at 1 pound 3.8 ounces or 1 pound 4 ounces. And the Konica comes in at 1 pound 4 ounces or 1 pound 5 ounces. So despite it having a few more features, and there's some pluses and minuses with each one, the Konica is a slightly heavier camera, even though it's not as wide, if you recall. So today, who would this camera be for? Well, this would be a good camera for somebody who's looking for something very simple, a modest lens, and doesn't mind the fact that there are just 3 shutter speeds. Some people want that look, that slightly old vintage look to their photos, and they're okay with the with the physical limits, and in this case being the shutter. This is otherwise not a bad looking camera. You'll see that they actually put in some of the leatherette covering here on top of the viewfinder housing. And so it looks slightly different than other cameras and doesn't look too cheap, and it's not bad. You should also note that Ricoh actually outlived Konica as a photographic company, and today continues to produce digital cameras under its own name, as well as film and digital cameras under the Pentax brand. So how would I rate this camera? I would rate this camera 8.6. It's not spectacular in anything that it does. It does fall a bit short in the number of shutter speeds that it's offered and the fact that it only has a triplet lens. However, in the 1950s, a lot of Japanese camera makers were still using triplet lenses, although quite a few had also moved on to Tessar type. So it's slightly disappointing that Ricoh wasn't using a higher quality lens. However, at that time, which is still 8 years after World War II had ended, Japan was still rebuilding, and so the fact that it used a triplet isn't that shocking. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, please think about hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you'd like to leave a comment, please do so below or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. And don't forget to check out my channel for other videos about cameras and photographic things. And I'll see you on the next video.